everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for the week ending on June 13th, 2025. We are here with Jos and me, Arianne. First, a summary of the news. An Alabama judge orders WPATH to release info. The FTC announces a workshop on the dangers of gender-affirming care. Children's Hospital Los Angeles is preparing to halt its youth transition center, and a review of the New York Times podcast, The Protocol. We'll start with you, Jos.
Thanks, Ariane. In a major legal move out of Alabama, a judge has ordered the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH, to release video footage from its past 3 annual conferences from 2021 to 2023, along with a 2023 training session. The videos previously kept from public view are now part of a civil case challenging the state's ban on gender transition care for minors. Alabama's Attorney General subpoenaed WPATH's internal materials, which reportedly revealed the deep concerns within the group about the scientific basis for such treatments and efforts to avoid legal trouble. Documents also suggest possible coordination with the ACLU to influence insurance policies and legal protection for healthcare providers. This is an interesting development, and we will keep you updated when we know more. Now to some interesting news from the FTC. The Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, has announced a public workshop titled The Dangers of Gender-Affirming Care for Minors, set for July 9th, 2025. The event will be live-streamed online with access details to be published the day of the event at ftc.gov. The workshop aims to examine whether medical professionals or organizations have engaged in unfair or deceptive practices in providing gender-affirming care treatments to minors. Citing its authority under Section 5 of the FTC Act, the agency will hear testimony from a wide range of participants, including physicians, medical ethicists, whistleblowers, detransitioners, and parents. Their insights will be drawn from research, clinical experience, and personal journeys. The event follows an executive order from President Donald Trump that rescinds federal support for gender-affirming care for minors. The order sharply criticized such treatments, calling them harmful and based on unsupported medical claims. The FTC says the workshop will help assess whether consumers, especially parents and minors, have been subjected to misleading claims or insufficient warnings regarding the risks and efficacy of gender-affirming interventions. Due to security concerns, in-person attendance will be by invitation only. The Commission emphasized its role in consumer protection, encouraging the public to stay informed about scams and unfair practices through its consumer resources and fraud reporting platforms. Finally, in a fairly monumental turn of events, Children's Hospital Los Angeles, which is run by Dr. Johanna Olson-Kennedy,
if you want breasts at a later point in your life, you can go and get them,
is preparing to shut down its nationally recognized Center for Trans Youth Health and Development this summer, according to emails obtained by the Times. The announcement, delivered to nearly 3,000 families, cited mounting federal pressure under the Trump administration as the primary reason for the closure. The center will cease operations on July 22nd. Hospital leadership explained that continued operation would jeopardize their ability to serve other pediatric patients, given recent warnings from the federal agencies about legal consequences for providers offering gender-affirming care. Officials pointed specifically to escalating actions by the Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, and the FBI, signaling potential prosecutions under new federal guidance. Once a pioneering program in the field, offering puberty blockers, hormones, and surgical procedures for trans-identified youth on public insurance, the Trans Youth Center has come under intense scrutiny in recent months. Earlier this year, the hospital paused care for some patients before reversing the decision following public outcry and state intervention. California's Attorney General has reiterated that equal access to health care remains protected under state law, though the hospital's message suggests diminishing support and growing financial uncertainty have worsened its position. Officials said, quote, "This painful and difficult decision was driven by the need to safeguard CHLA's ability to operate amid significant external pressures beyond our control," end quote. With such a big system for the medicalization of children falling, it will be interesting to see how many more dominoes fall in the coming months. And now to you, Ariane.
Thanks, Jos. As we promised last week, we are going to offer a review of the New York Times podcast called The Protocol, about the controversy behind puberty blockers and medical care for gender dysphoric minors. The title of this podcast echoes the term the Dutch protocol. That is, the protocol used by the Dutch researchers who were the first people to prescribe puberty blockers for gender dysphoric minors, with the idea that the blockers would, quote, buy the patient's time to make a decision about whether to go forward with cross-sex hormones and make a full gender transition. The podcast consists of 6 episodes, each about 45 minutes long, give or take, co-hosted by Azine Goreshi and Austin Mitchell. They interviewed a variety of people in the field. These people include 2 trans-identifying people, one male and one female, who are among the early patients in the Netherlands treated with the Dutch protocol, plus Dr. Annelou de Vries, who helped develop the Dutch protocol, Laura Edwards-Leeper, the American who brought the Dutch protocol over from the Netherlands to America and is presented as a moderate who thinks transgender medicine in the US has gotten too lax, but also opposes bans on pediatric transition. They also interviewed Scott Leibowitz as someone who is in a similar camp and who trained with Leeper. On the other hand, they also got on the podcast Dr. Joanna Olson-Kennedy and Marcy Bowers, who are presented as people who think the Dutch protocol is too restrictive and think we should listen to kids' self-professed gender identities without much scrutiny. They also interviewed British researcher Dr. Hilary Cass, who did the Cass review that called into question the use of puberty blockers, and they interviewed whistleblower Jamie Reed as someone who advocates for bans on pediatric transition. They also found an array of people who were transitioned at a young age and are happy about it, and along with some parents of these trans-identified kids. Now, my take on the podcast, and this became evident to me after a few episodes in when they interviewed Annelou de Vries, is that the hosts want to do 2 things. First, they want to genuinely acknowledge that there is a problem with the state of transgender medicine in the US, particularly when it comes to minors. But secondly, they also don't want to concede any ground to people in the US who want to ban pediatric transition entirely. Instead, they want to paint a picture of Republicans, along with some liberal enablers, trying to roll back the clock on transgender rights with allegedly draconian restrictions, which, in the opinion of the podcast, will harm trans kids and their families. So, what is the narrative they settle on to balance these 2 perspectives? It's that the Dutch are basically the good guys, that the Dutch researchers that came up with the Dutch protocol to prescribe puberty blockers to gender dysphoric youth were well-intentioned and genuinely tried to help these struggling gender dysphoric kids when no one else was offering anything to help them. And that the Dutch were cautious and put a lot of safeguards in their protocols to prevent people from being mislabeled as transgender and being medicalized unnecessarily. And that things went wrong when Americans screwed up when they tried to apply the Dutch protocol in their own country while eliminating the safeguards that the Dutch put in place. As a consequence, too many people were medicalized, more and more people detransitioned, and many of these detransitioners joined the Republican-led conspiracy to strip away gender-affirming care for all families with trans kids. That's their narrative. It's a convenient narrative because it allows them to kind of have their cake and eat it too, to make it look like they're doing something to address the crisis that underlies so-called gender-affirming care for kids, while also not giving those pesky Republicans credit for anything. Instead, it's those enlightened, progressive Northern Europeans who have their act together, and us backwards Americans are just not capable of getting the nuance. The problem is that their presentation has so many contradictions and inconsistencies in approach that it doesn't hold up under its weight, in my opinion. So, for example, take the interview with Dr. Cass in episode 5. Dr. Cass brought up that research conducted by the British Tavistock Clinic failed to replicate the results of the Dutch researchers, and found that patients who were given puberty blockers showed no improvement. Likewise, the American paper published by Dr. Olson-Kennedy also failed to validate the Dutch protocol. Dr. Cass also pointed to flaws in the Dutch paper, for example, selection bias. They only selected the first 70 people from the original research cohort to go on to hormones, and these might have been the ones who responded best to the puberty blockers. Also, that the Dutch patients were receiving therapy at the time. They were also medicalized. So for me, listening to all this created some cognitive dissonance. On one hand, the Dutch researchers were presented otherwise sympathetically, and they even gave Annelou de Vries the final word in the last episode, which follows a series of snippets of interviews with parents and trans-identified patients who talk about how life-saving their trans medical care was for them. And yet here in the interview with Dr. Cass, they were acknowledging that the research that underlies the Dutch protocol was flawed and failed to replicate. So what was it? Is the evidence behind the Dutch protocol reasonable and solid, or is it not? I don't think the podcast offered a coherent explanation. But perhaps most egregious was episode 4, which was their interview with Jamie Reed. She was the whistleblower in Missouri who wrote a whole affidavit exposing problems with pediatric gender care in her state, which ultimately contributed to the state banning pediatric transition. Jamie has since gone on to found LGBT, now LGB Courage Coalition, which we, LGB Alliance USA, have worked with. This is their only interview with someone in the United States who supports the bans on pediatric transition. That is the interview that the podcast did with Jamie Reed. And it seemed pretty clear that the interviewers were acting far more aggressive to her than to the other interviewees. For one thing, they kept trying to ask these rather trivial political gotcha questions, like, how can you support bans when you have an anarchist tattoo? Stuff like that. They were trying to pigeonhole her as an extremist who betrayed her own far-lefty principles. And then they tried to grill her about one part of her affidavit where she apparently quoted someone as saying something about a patient's health problems when in fact Jamie had only heard that quote secondhand through a nurse. And so the podcast host had the mother of the trans-identifying patient in question confront Jamie about how angry she was about the misquote, blah, blah, blah. Now, I think it's perfectly reasonable for journalists to draw attention to potential nitpicky flaws like that. I mean, that's just what journalists do. They investigate things. My question is, why single out Jamie Reed for this scrutiny? I don't recall any of the other interview subjects as being interrogated or investigated in this way. It kind of stuck out like a sore thumb, and I couldn't help but think the podcast host had an agenda here. Now, Jamie Reed defended herself in episode 28 of the Informed Dissent podcast. She made a point that she initially developed quite a rapport with Azim, who was the female co-host of the podcast. They spent hours going through papers together. But Jamie said that Azim turned into a different person when the other host, Austin, came along. Jamie claimed that Austin was much more of a dyed-in-the-wool lefty progressive with a partisan agenda. And that all makes sense of the podcast to me as a whole, because it had some solid interviews and asked some good questions, but overlaid it with a sort of Republicans are bad message that distracted from and even undercut their investigation. We'll put the link to both the Protocol podcast and the Informed Dissent podcast in question in the show notes. And by the way, Jamie Reed did a really good job in that Informed Dissent podcast explaining her views and why she rejected the Laura Edwards Leeper approach. That is the idea that puberty blocking is acceptable for a small number of minors as long as they can be diagnosed correctly. She points to something that I also thought while listening to the Protocol podcast, that Edwards Leeper doesn't offer a methodology for how to correctly identify true trans people who would benefit from medical treatment without misdiagnosing others. Jamie Reed also explains another problem with trying to identify the one true trans kid out of a group of a dozen or more false ones. That the true trans kid would, in all likelihood, grow up to be gay. Do we really want to single out homosexuality for medicalization? That brings up another critique I have of the Protocol podcast. While the protocol did bring up the issue of how sometimes gay kids can be mistaken for trans, it doesn't do a whole lot to investigate that avenue of discussion, even when it would have been relevant. For example, the Dutch trans-identified female they interviewed, who was apparently the first person ever given puberty blockers for gender dysphoria, mentioned a butch lesbian childhood playmate. According to the trans interviewee nicknamed FG, quote, "And ever since then, I always did gym with the boys. But so did she. And at the time, we both decided we were boys. And I was convinced she was the same, and she just turned out to be a butch lesbian." Unquote. I wanted to know more about why FG decided that she herself was actually a boy, while her childhood playmate decided she was a butch lesbian. But the interviewer, Azine, didn't really go down that route. There's a lot more I could say about this podcast, but I'll conclude for now by saying that I think it was largely a missed opportunity, unfortunately. There was some worthwhile information, but it didn't present a fully balanced picture. So, Joss, I'll turn to you. Do you have any thoughts or questions about this podcast?
Yeah, Ariane, actually quite a lot. I started listening, but didn't finish listening to the podcast, and I was really struck by the emotional tone that it led with when it opens up and you hear Trump saying or whatever about the executive orders, and then it's immediately followed by the different voices of trans-identifying people saying that we're here and we're never going to go anywhere. One of them even actually uses the term transhuman in that opening episode, which I thought was really curious.
If they cannot get treatment, children will die.
These treatments do much more harm than good.
Trans kids are under attack. What do we do?
We are not going to rest until every child is protected, until trans ideology is entirely erased from the earth.
We are trans people. We are transhuman, and we will never be eradicated.
But it felt very emotionally charged straight out the gate. Like, not necessarily like it was reporting something that was fact-based or well-researched. But this is just from my little glimpse of it, because I didn't listen to the whole podcast. But my question to you, as somebody who has listened to the whole thing, and because we had a comment from a parent of an ROGD kid, do you think that this is useful for a parent of an ROGD kid to take the time to listen to? It's probably close to 6 hours, maybe less, all told, between the 6 episodes. Is it worth their time, and is it disseminating any useful information for them?
I don't think I would recommend it to someone who has an ROGD kid and is like struggling to know what to do with it. Because like I said, I felt like the podcast was very internally contradictory. And like you said, there was all this it was sort of an interesting weave of where it had this very emotional introduction, and it also had a very emotional final episode where it was basically just snippet after snippet of trans kid and parent of trans kid talking about how important gender affirming care is, and finally giving Dr. Anna Lou DeVries the final word. So there was a lot of this emotional stuff, plus the Jamie Reed episode where they had an extremely angry person confront her. But then it also had some genuinely interesting, sort of more sober-minded interviews. So I think it was sort of half-baked and overbaked, if that makes sense. Like half-baked in some ways and overbaked in other ways. And so I'm not sure if like a parent of an ROGD kid would really benefit from this. Listening to the interview, what I got out of it, I thought the most valuable things were listening to how insane Dr. Joanna Olson-Kennedy was. And also Marcy Bowers was also pretty insane.
What episode is the insanity? At what point does the insanity come in to play? Because this was something else that I thought about while you were starting to give the analysis of this episode, was that some months back, and I can't remember when, but I feel like it was last summer or fall, we reported about the Dutch, there's a male and female who were suing Dutch medical centers for harm.
Right. Yeah. So the insane interviews, I think it was episode 3, if I'm looking that correctly, when things come to the US. They had Laura Edwards Leeper, who they're trying to present as sort of, like I said, the one who just wants to find some middle ground. But that, I think that was also the one where they had Olson-Kennedy, and they also had Olson-Kennedy in episode 5, along with Marcy Bowers. In terms of the Dutch thing, that was another thing. They 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 really didn't scrutinize the Dutch protocol itself much at all. This was also something that was very well done in that informed dissent episode, the response episode that I mentioned before. The panelists on that episode did a very good job at explaining how a lot of the what it's supposed to be safeguarding in the Dutch protocol might not be as strong as people say it is, how there were problems, that there were patients that died after going on the Dutch protocol. There was a lot of information that this podcast left out about the problems with the Dutch protocol. And really, the main person who critiqued the Dutch protocol was Dr. Hilary Cass. And she pointed out how the UK's own research didn't replicate it. But like I said, that was a contradiction in the podcast narrative that they never really quite figured out.
That was definitely a point of curiosity for me, is would they even address the case, these two specific cases in Holland, in the Netherlands, where they had patients, former patients, that were pushing back. And I get, like, that makes your half-baked and overbaked point there really take shape, because it seems like there's just a lot of loose strands that are open, or untied, unraveled, whatever. So do you feel like this is more the New York Times, like, taking the opportunity to get some attention, or do you feel like it's more of like a pro-trans piece ultimately to sway public opinion in this tumultuous time where we have these executive orders and there's so many things that are all over the place now with where trans identified medicine is concerned? What do you think the angle is, or what is the purpose of putting together a 6-hour podcast series? What's the end goal for them, do you think?
I think it does seem opportunistic to me in that they know this has now been brought to the forefront as a very controversial issue, and they know they can't just completely brush this under the rug or say there are no problems at all. They want to look like they're actually adequately addressing the issue, but they want to sort of reframe the narrative to their advantage. Like they don't, like I said, they didn't want to give the like pro pediatric bans side. They want to make them look like a bunch of extremists. That's another thing. They didn't interview detransitioners. They said there was like that a lot of these detransitioners got involved into like Republican conspiracies of like, but they didn't actually interview the detransitioners in question. So I suspect their agenda, first of all, is opportunism. It's to capitalize on this issue, but I think it's also because they are trying to push back. I think they're hoping that if people see, oh, there is this reasonable middle ground opinion, and if we just take this reasonable middle ground opinion, this problem will all go away. But like I said, that's sort of a wishful thinking narrative.
Especially because it doesn't seem like a middle ground. If they're not reporting factually both sides of the issue, or they're just discounting detransitioners as now all Republicans, which is just not the case. If they didn't have people from like DIAG, there's a lot of Democrats and progressives that are against or opposed to transgender medicine. If they didn't put any of that into the podcast, it's definitely would not be balanced, in my opinion.
Well, they interviewed Jamie Reed, who was the like a far lefty anarchist person, but they made her look bad.
Yes, but if she's the one and only, and they made
Yeah.
her look bad, then that's not I don't want to use the term like fair and balanced, but it's not fair nor balanced if it just sounds like a really pro-trans piece ultimately.
And I would say too, they should interview to conservative voices as well. Like, like you could interview someone like Chloe Cole, who's a detransitioner and who seems to be, from what I can tell, fairly conservative, but she's an important voice. She's a worthwhile voice. I've actually met her before. They don't even have to bring the politics angle, so I kind of wish they didn't talk so much about how, it's all a partisan thing, but I mean, it's part of the picture that I've seen before, just based on some of my interactions in these progressive circles, is they're just so swamped by this narrative of like Republicans bad. They won't do anything to concede ground to them, but they'll listen to people in other countries. They'll listen to Northern Europeans. So that's up to the Northern Europeans to accidentally say something that undercuts their narrative, like Dr. Katz saying we couldn't replicate the Dutch protocol.
It's curious and it's unfortunate that politics and the situation in the States is what it is. That it's so polarized, so divided. And the bringers of good are the progressives and the evildoers are the conservatives in this situation. And in life in general, we know that that's just not true. And it's really reducing everything to such a insane level. Like it becomes non unproductive, unuseful. I don't have a whole lot of time to dedicate to podcasts or whatever else, so I have to be real choosy about where I spend my time. And it just seems like 6 hours is a lot. Like if you're gonna do a pro trans piece, they probably could have rounded that out a lot faster than six long episodes. I don't know. It just seems kind of self-serving.
Some of the most valuable stuff was in the nut jobs. So like Joanna Olson-Kennedy, who, you mentioned in your story about how her LA clinic looks like there's signs that that's going to be shutting down, but I didn't realize how unhinged she was. I mean, I should have known that, but
If you want breasts at a later point in your life, you can go and get them.
one thing I recall her saying was how she said she doesn't really care about research. She only cares about her observations as a clinician. And she admits that she's using, she just intuitively knows that what she's doing is the right thing to do. And likewise, Marcy Bowers was sort of the voice that trashed Cass, basically mostly trashing Dr. Cass's credentials and saying she didn't work with trans kids. And there was some emotionally laden thing here, like if Dr. Cass had only witnessed a kid, how happy that kid would be when they transitioned, the different personality that would emerge from that trans kid's transition, Dr. Cass would have changed her mind. They're fully admitting here that they're going based on their personal observations and they're not really doing what we would think of as science.
And you would think when you're talking about medically altering children's bodies that would be based in science and rooted in something beyond someone's personal feelings and intuition. That is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, and that also goes back to another flaw in the show, which is that they don't really talk about the whole question of the whole question of gender identity in general. Like, how does that even make sense? What was the sociological origin of the idea of having, a gender identity that's different than biological sex? So if you're not someone who's already exposed to that debate, that piece is going to be missing. Because there are a lot of people still who just think that whole thing is just crazy. The whole especially if they're older, they were never taught that growing up. So where is that even coming from? And for people like me who were taught about that growing up. There was nothing in this program that told us where's that coming from? Is there anyone who's really going to challenge that idea, that very concept? So the philosophical underpinnings were not really challenged much in this podcast.
Aside from Jamie, how many gay people did they talk to?
I mean, I'm assuming, I think Jamie was the only person who called herself gay.
That was like a lingering question for me about the podcast in general, was would they really zero in at any point about the issues in the gay community? And there's a lot of different societal impacts on why this has happened and that shifted. Did they talk about any of that at any point?
They so like I said, they did mention the issue, briefly mentioned maybe a couple times in different episodes about this issue of conflating homosexuality with transgenderism, but like I said, they didn't really go into great depth about that, the gay angle. Once again, I thought it was a little bit surface level.
Did they ever mention AGP?
No, that's like the forbidden frontier, I feel.
It seems to me like that would be part of the necessary reporting to get a full analysis of what's happening.
I think what would have been, if I were to advise the people on how they could have done a better job, is actually for the hosts to admit their biases from the beginning, regardless of what they are. If they pro pediatric transition, go ahead, say that and talk about that. And then at the end of the podcast, instead of having this emotional schmeal with all these trans kids and stuff, maybe the podcast host can explain what, like, if or how their views have changed, what interviewees they thought were interesting, what points were made that they agreed with or disagreed with. Because even if they had a bias one way or the other, showing their train of thought would have been, I think, interesting. Instead, I think they made themselves to be like these neutral voices and presented the podcast in this way. And I think that was disingenuous.
Yeah, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to, like, on the other, like something like Gender a Wider Led podcasts, Sasha and Stella, they're not presenting themselves as being unbiased. I mean, they're constantly talking about their opinions and what interviews they liked and stuff. And I think for this podcast, for me to take a podcast like this seriously, I would like to hear more actually about the podcast hosts and what the train of their thought is.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think that was kind of what held me up a little bit, was in that leading episode, immediately I had so many questions about who is this person? Why is that person important? Who are the reporters that are bringing us the story? Why should I care what their angle is? Are they super biased? Like, there's a flood of questions that came right away when I was hearing these emotional appeals. Is there anything else about the podcast that you found salient you want to share?
If I'm trying to be as generous to the podcast as I can and be as optimistic about it, I think maybe if you're talking about someone who's on the political left and maybe has some concerns about this pediatric transition thing, but is nowhere prepared to, like, go full geek, maybe this podcast could be an useful entryway for this avenue of discussion. I'm just trying to think back to myself, maybe like in 2020 or so, when I had some concerns about pediatric transition, but maybe was still sympathetic to the Dr. Laura Edwards-Leeper perspective about, like, oh, maybe there are some trans kids out there that we just need to properly diagnose with the right protocol. Maybe this podcast could have been helpful as sort of an entry point to this discussion. While as if they maybe something that was more, full blown Jamie Reed, maybe I wouldn't have been ready for that yet. So if I want to be as optimistic about this podcast as possible, that might be where its utility lies, is in those almost peaking people.
I am curious about that because I wonder if it would sway people in the opposite direction, because it is so emotional, especially what you said about the last episode. and that how the intro episodes are also these voices, calling for trans rights and whatnot. And then the hit on Jamie as well, if that would sway people to also that are kind of on the moderate level that would hear this and then just have their heartstrings tugged at with these emotional appeals.
Yeah, that worries me too. I honestly don't know ultimately if this podcast will be a net positive or a net negative or a net neutral.
Thank you for listening to this and for your analysis about it. I appreciate that.
Thank you for your curiosity and questions.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think our audience will be grateful to hear as well. You may have just saved a bunch of people 6 hours.
Hopefully, yeah. Anyway, with that, thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope to see you again next week. Remember to like and subscribe.
The misdiagnosis thing, that I don't even know how they would, because the diagnosis alone is nonsensical. They don't even ask any really questions with that. I mean, if you look at the diagnosis, it's seriously just like, oh, I'm uncomfortable with my sex. There's the diagnosis. The patient said that. That's it. There's no real diagnosis for this. So I think they picked the misdiagnosis probably because that's the easiest route to take.
Yeah, this is what doesn't make sense to me is in order for something to be misdiagnosed, there has to be a target for what a correct diagnosis would be. So I'm curious, how are they going to establish what the correct diagnosis is? The only way I could see correct diagnosis working is the person didn't regret it, but that's not really objective. Like, this is starting to get into circular reasoning sort of territory.
It's starting. It's been circular reasoning. And I wonder if that's why they picked it though. Like, I'm wondering if this is a kind of a long game in a way of being like, look, we got to start picking this apart here because this makes no sense. You get them in a corner. What's the diagnosis here? How do you know if you do misdiagnose? There's no way to know if you can misdiagnose. Well, that sounds ridiculous.